in the report to the end user or the customer, the source systems has to capture lot of input data. The lot of input data, I mean the data which is narrowed down or which is in the lowest granularity till that point of the data that we need to capture in order to show the best report to the customer. So that is actually giving a challenge of the data is growing in volume and variety. So the data growing in a way that you have to capture a lot of information on the source system, which is actually defining a huge volume of the data, and it's of different varieties of the data. So how that will be answered by Talend? Talend is capable of processing huge volume of data and wide variety of the data. When I say volume, that means the processing speed of Talend is much more better when compared with the other ETL tools, and the variety of data that it can process involves XML files, text files, flat files, CSV files, XML files, and a lot of other inputs also, other input source systems also it is capable of processing. And developing ETL solutions in-house can be a long and complex effort. Let us suppose there is a scenario where you need to develop a lot of complex logic in a single place. Then you may be able to develop that complex logic, complex coding at a single point in a single place, but it seems to be complex because other than you, nobody will be able to understand it properly, and also if any enhancements comes to the existing coding, then it might be difficult in future to go to that particular point and make the change because of the impact that it is having on the other lines of the code. So in that cases, excuse me, in that cases what happens is Talend will give the flexibility of dividing that code into bits and pieces, then developing them in different subjobs and linking those subjobs together so that the whole complex logic can be executed at once. This is also advantageous. This is also having the advantage of, in case any enhancements to the code in the future is required, then you will go to that particular point and make the change in the code so that you don't need to touch any other parts of the code. That is the that is the capability that the Talend is having, like splitting the code into bits and pieces, developing them in sub jobs, and connecting them in a main job by linking them. That is the advantage that we have on Talend. And Talend is comparatively comes for the low pricing. That means the other ETL tools like Informatica, DataStage, they are a little expensive, but comparatively Talend is less expensive when compared with the other tools. That's why this is more preferable by the mid-size, mid-cap, what do you say, small companies or growing companies. They'll be having the advantage out of its cost. And next is about Talend. So Talend is a leading developer for open source data integration systems. You have Talend is available in two versions. One is open source version and another is the licensed version. Open source version means you can go to talend.com site and create an account and download the code and make use of it. And another thing is the licensed version of the same Talend, where you have to buy the license from Talend by paying them. It is having its own additional capabilities when compared with the open source, which I'm going to discuss in a while. And Talend is powerful ETL and data management technology tool. That means Talend basically will be helpful in order to load the data into a data warehouse which is designed in an organization on a particular domain, and it is also capable of integrating the data from one environment to other environment. Because what happens is in some of the projects where you don't need to have a typical data warehouse system, you may have to get the data from source system, apply some transformations or logics or calculations and aggregations, and load the data into a table or a file and send the data across to the customers or end users. In that case, also Talend is helpful. And it is having a unified repository characteristics which is used for storing and reusing the metadata. This repository is of two types here. One is you let us suppose you have a database for which you need to establish a connection, and you need to get the data from different tables in it. And in a single job, you are going to extract data from one table. In another job, you are going to extract the data from another table in a single database. In that scenario, you have to create two connections. But if you create the connection in the repository once, and you can use that connection and in any places as much possible, in order which will avoid creating one more connection again. That means repository is capable of holding a generic metadata which can be used as and when it is required. And another thing is that if you have a job created by one developer, can be accessed by another developer when it is saved in a repository. So it is having these capabilities that you can maintain single version of the code across your organization, which is called as an integrity, and also it will reduce the complexity of creating multiple connections as in many places, which is not a standard practice while doing the development. And it is having the broadest data connectivity support. That means whatever is the source system, we have some components to connect to the Talend, connect to that source system in Talend. I have my source system, I have my source data in SAP. Yes, we have SAP connectors available. And I have my data in a simple text file. Yes, we do have connectors to connect to a text file, XML files, CSV files, JSON files. A lot of connectors are available to get the information from the different source systems. So any questions so far? Pramila, any questions? Gopi, any questions?
No, Govardhan.
Okay, fine. And this is the introduction about Talend. Talend was founded in 2005 by two fantastic guys, Diard and Bunan. So they have started their first product in 2006 with the name Talend Open Studio. Initially, they started this product with the initials to Talend Open Studio. And from that point of time, it is having huge number of downloads in the Open Studio. Then they have bought the licensed version with additional capabilities. And it is having two types of product offerings, where Talend Open Studio, which is no-cost data management solution, and the second thing is subscription-based data management solutions. So these are the differences that we can talk about in compared with the Open Studio and as well as with the integration suite. Talend integration suite is nothing but TIS, which is the licensed version of the Talend. And this is open source, which is no cost version of Talend. That means this can be downloaded by logging into talend.com site, creating an account and downloading it, whatever required. And here this is an integration suite where you have to buy license from Talend. And Talend Open Studio, of course, if any company is having open source and licensed version will be having more advantages when compared with the open source version. So number of components are limited. That means you will not be able to get all the connectivity components, but most of the things will be covered. And in the Talend integration suite, which is TIS, we have more components when compared with the Talend Open Studio. And jobs developed can't be scheduled using schedulers. Talend Administration Center. But here in the licensed version, we have Talend Administration Center, which can be used for scheduling the jobs. And it is a single user development studio, which means your desktop or laptop is going to be your client and your server. So you'll be having it for a single user. And it is Talend Integration Suite is a multi-user studio where multiple users can be able to access the Talend Studio and the projects that are created in it, and the authorizations will be given to each user based on their roles and responsibilities. So this is the difference between these two. And this is the architecture. This is the Talend architecture. So this is the architecture of Talend licensed version, where we have client and server architecture. So the components that are shown here on the above are the client side, and the components shown in the below in the Eclipse, it is on the server side. Before me explaining about this architecture, I would like to tell you like how a talent will be made available in an organization when they are opting for the first time. So what happens is, company will pay some money to the talent and they will send the talent integration suite, which is a set of zip files. These zip files are nothing but multiple components which are functioning together to make this talent work. This is the first step that we are going to get an email from talent. Next, there will be some administrators who are called talent administrators who will be actually installing the talent integration suite in a server, and that server is going to be either Windows or Linux or Unix environment. So when you are installing, when the administrator is installing, he has to install on the Windows as an administrator role, and when he is installing it on Linux or Unix, then he has to install it as a root user, so that he will be having the authorizations to the folder that he is trying to install in. So once the installation is completed, next thing comes is the configuration. In the configuration, what happens is, for the configuration, he need a web browser like Chrome or Internet Explorer. Then he need an URL. I will tell you how this URL will be formed when I'm talking in the architecture. And then when the configuration is done, I hope you guys are understanding the flow. First, we will get the zip file after paying the money. Second thing is, talent administrator will do the installation in the server, either a Windows server or Linux server based on the company's choice. And then once the installation is completed, we need to configure certain parameters for talent. And once that configuration is done, then the developers will be given authorization to work with a username and password. That means Govardhan is a developer. Now administrator will come to Govardhan and he will give username and password. Govardhan, use this studio executable.exe and then use this username and password. Put this username and password at the starting so that it will open the studio for you to do the development. So by keeping these three things in the mind, installation, configuration, and then development starting point. By keeping these 3 points in the mind, we will go to the architecture. Now, what happens is, Govardhan will be given one username and password with a studio executable. Double click that, it will open the studio. And before it is actually taking you to the studio, you have to give the username and password, which Govardhan is doing here. So once I put the username and password, since the configuration is already done by the administrator, these components will start working. I will explain about the roles and responsibilities of these components. So this is the starting point where I am starting the functionalities and the uses of these components. So Govardhan will give the username and password in the studio. As soon as I give and say OK, one request will be going to this command line server in the Talent Administration Center, where this Talent Administration Center is a boss to the server environment. He has to acknowledge that, okay, Govardhan is given with a username and password and they are correct and he is a valid user. Then my studio will be opening and I will be starting the development. Okay, I got one requirement, I have completed the development and I just saved it. So when I save it, a request will go to the SVN server. This SVN server is not part of the zip files that are provided by the talent. This one I have to install in any server. This SVN server is basically used to store the information that a developer is doing in the studio. Like Govardhan will create a job, he has used some components, he has made some connections, he has written some scenarios. All the project related metadata will be stored in the SVN server. So when I save some job here, a request will go to the SVN server whether it should accept my save or not. Then that whether it should accept my save or not can be checked by this administration center. That means SVN will in turn communicate to the administration center. Govardhan is trying to save one job. Can I save it? Then this administration center will respond back to the SVN server, yes, he is a valid user. You can accept when he saves something. Then that information that I saved here will be stored in the project metadata in the SVN server. So the relationship between Studio, SVN server and the administration center is such a way that the authorizations for doing something in the Studio will be checked by the administration center. The work that I do here will be saved in the SVN server, where SVN server in turn will check my authorization with Talend Administration Center. So these are the three components that are related in. Now, this is the web browser. Like I said, once the installation is completed by the administrator, he has to do some configuration. That configuration is nothing but it's a meeting. It's an arranged meeting for introduction of these components to each other. That can be done in the web browser. So once the installation is done, I need to configure. For the configuration, I need to form an URL. Once the installation is done successfully, I will open one web browser and I will type this URL. Server name is the server name where you did the installation of Talend. So http://servername:8080 is the port using which the communications between Talend and the Studio will happen. And activity monitoring console is something which is actually running continuously to make sure that the connections and the functioning of the parameters or components is going properly or not. So I'll take this URL, I'll form this URL and I'll give this username and password. This username and password are default. These remain same for any configuration. So as an administrator, after completing the installation, I'll take this URL, I'll put it in the browser, I'll give the username and password, then it will open me a GUI where I will be able to give the details of these components. I'll be giving the details of these components in the web browser. This web browser is in turn accessing the installed Talend. So there I'll make the introduction, meet Mr. Execution Server. He is residing in this server and it's his username and password. Meet Mr. SVN Server. His server is this one, his port is this one, his username and password is this one. Meet Mr. Database. He is storing the admin metadata, and in order to access this guy, this is the username and this is the password. So when I put all this information here, Talend Administration Center will get that information. So as and when it is communicating with the other components, whenever this component requires this component's information, it will give. Whenever this component requires this component's information, this will give. This is a meeting point for all the new guys, new components. Guys, any questions? Is it clear or confusing? Pramila?
Yeah, Gordon. I have one question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So, I mean, I understand that that a Talend Administrator Center is the main component to communicate with the surroundings, like TIS Studio, I mean, like SVN, admin metadata,
Yes.
I mean, database and everything.
Yes.
So, the point which I did not get you is the web browser, I mean, like, see, you have already created one job and you have already saved it in the SVN.
No. That will come at after completing the installation and configuration.
Okay.
I'm talking about the second step. In order to explain this one, I jump to the third step, which is installing, configuring, and developing.
Yeah.
But before developing, we have to make sure that installation and configuration is done.
Okay. Okay. So
before doing the installation, before doing the development in Studio, I have to make sure that I configure. So these components are introduced, with each other in the web browser. Then this will come into picture. But for the explanation's sake, I started with the studio.
Okay, got
Is
it.
it clear now?
Yeah.
Okay. So installation, then
So
configuration in the web
basically,
browser.
you are basically doing the configuration in the web browser to communicate all these things. Talend,
Yes.
administrator, center, SPN and all. Okay, got it.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Gopi, you have any questions, Gopi? Okay. Thank you. So the configuration will be done in the web browser where you're introducing the components with each other. And also, as an administrator, in the configuration, I will create some users, Govardhan, Pramila, Gopi. These three guys are my developers. So I'll be creating one username and password for these three folks, and I'll be giving them the executable so that they can put their information in the studio while starting the development. And also, Govardhan is working on a project ABC. Pramila is working on a project XYZ. And Gopi is also working on XYZ. So I will create the projects also in the web browser. So configuration is nothing but introducing the components to each other as well as creating the users. Users are nothing but the developers, and creating the projects. Projects are nothing but on which the developers will be working, and giving the necessary authorizations to the respective users on their relevant projects. That means Govardhan is working on a project XYZ. Then Pramila and Gopi shouldn't be having the access to my project because they're working on ABC project. In the same way, Govardhan is not supposed to be having the authorizations to the ABC project. So the project that I am working, the project that I am doing the development, I'll be having the access, but not for the other projects. That is also you can schedule in web browser. So configuration is nothing but introducing the components to each other, creating the users, creating the projects, and creating the relationships between the users and projects in terms of the authorizations. And again in the authorizations, what kind of authorization? Does he have read-write permissions or read-only permissions or write-only permissions, or he can do anything, or can he be administrator? So all those things will be configured in the web browser. So once the configuration is done, this studio we will start actually doing the development. And this Talend Administration Center is capable of holding the information of each and every component, but it has to store this information in some place. That means the metadata about the administration, who are the users created, what are the projects created, what are the permission levels, and what are the roles and responsibilities. All this information again will be stored in the backend called a database, H2 database. So when you buy a Talend license, you will be getting an inbuilt database called H2 database. That H2 database will store the metadata of the administration. That is this DB. And remember, this information also we will give in this component when configuring through the web browser. And in the web browser, we can do one more thing, which is scheduling the jobs. So Govardhan has developed one job, he successfully tested it, and it has to be run every day at 8 p.m. Then what I'll do is in the web browser, if I have the authorization to schedule a job, I'll go there and schedule the job. When a job is scheduled at 8 p.m., this administration center will assign one execution server. Mr. Execution Server, there is a job scheduled in the web browser at a particular point of time. You take care of it. Execution server will say, yes, boss. So this execution server will execute the job at a particular scheduled time. That means scheduling jobs are taken care by the execution server or job server. And you can have multiple number of execution servers based on the project's criticality or project, how big your project is and all. And also, when doing the development in the studio, you may be testing it. Sometimes you have to run it there itself. So what happens is, in that case, this distant run, remember this TA studio and this TA studio is both same, but for the diagram purpose, it has been shown as a separate thing. When you are executing a job from the studio itself, that time also execution server will take care of that execution, which is on an ad hoc basis. Whenever you start running the job, execution server will come and run it for you. If you want to run a job which is scheduled, at that time also execution server will take care of the job's execution. So Talent Administration Center is a place where you will be having the information and control and commanding of all the other components. So is this clear, guys?
Yes, Govardhan.
Gopi, is this clear? Okay, fine. So coming to the course content, this I'll be providing the trainings on these three courses, whereas the basics will speak about only development, no administration, no installation. And the second thing is the enterprise, which speaks about development plus managing the administration work, not the installation, but managing it. And the third one is the administration, where this administration will speak purely about talent installation and configuration and setup. And coming to the course content, these are the learning objects, where we'll be having the Talend Open Studio on how to create a job, how to read the input from different source files and source systems, how do we transform the data, how do we execute the data, and how do we combine the columns, and how do we create the duplicate jobs, and how do we create the metadata and store it in a repository, and how do we create joins, and how do we capture the join failures, and how do we connect with the lookups, and how do we update the business model. Business model is very little topic here. How do we generate the random data, and how do we add constraints, and how do we replicate the same input in different flows. And we'll be working with the databases, how to connect to your database and get the information from the database, and how do we create metadata, how do we join the tables, and how do we finalize and build the jobs. And this is advanced topic, how do we connect to the web services, and how do we write the data, and how do we access the data from a web service. And this is the enterprise version, like how do we connect to a repository, and how do we perform change data capturing, how do we monitor the jobs, how to run the jobs remotely, and what is meant by parallel execution, and how to access the SVN branch. SVN branch is nothing but, like I said, it is storing the project metadata, in which you will be having a repository and branches, SVN branches, and those branch is accessible for only few users who are having the authorizations levels. And this is the installation part, where installation administration will speak about installation and how do we create projects and how do we manage them. What is a job conductor? Job conductor is a place where we actually schedule the jobs. And activity monitoring console and command line server. Command line server is nothing but the boss that is actually sitting in the middle and taking care of all the other components and controlling it. So questions?
Govardhan, this is Pamela.
Yes. Yeah, Pamela.
Like you said, like we can install the Talend Open Studio in both either Windows machine or Linux machine, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So when you are saying SVN branches and all, it will be available in only Linux platform.
No. SVN server is to maintain the project metadata. We have Visual SVN or Tortoise SVN. These are the open source versions where you can download. We can install them. This is not the part of licensed version that you get. So these are the separate things. You just install them in a Windows server and give those credentials, give those login details in the administration center in the web browser while configuring it.
Okay.
Then you will be able to, that is one way that you can give the details to the administration center, and here you can create a project saying XYZ is a project in which I have a sub project and jobs. Okay, job 1, job 2, these are the jobs that you are going to create.
Okay.
Okay, and if you are working on job 1, and I will not be having the access on job 1 because you are already working on it. So that is where how we maintain the integrity of the jobs across the project.
Okay.
Any more questions? Okay, Gopi, you have any questions? You can type in the chat window if you have any. No? Okay. Fine. Thank you guys. Thanks for your time. I hope you had a very good session here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Gopi.